you probably read by the title, my first official fanfic story will be Encanto X Coco, Forgive but Never Forget. The reason for that will be, well, it'll be better explained in the plot, though if you really must know, it is a tale about forgiveness along with redemption. Though who gets redeemed is, well, I mean, for some of you who watched both movies, it's kind of obvious. But if you haven't, well, I suggest you probably watch the movie first before reading my story, because my story is basically a complete divergence from, well, Encanto at least. Though it, chronologically speaking, it takes place sometime after the events of Coco, or more specifically, 1 year after the events of Coco. So it's best to watch the movie first before you kind of delve into my story. All right. Now, for the inspirations that served as the basis for my story, I have met, I have read many different fanfics over the past few years, and I was inspired by how realistic yet moving they were, as they have a lot of heart that was put into them while making sure to entertain and teach readers like life lessons, which is what I intend to do for not only this story but even my original stories. If you guys haven't checked out my Brocade Baby story, but or at least the video promoting it. But other than that, I want to focus on Encanto X Coco, as it's basically like a big fan made, well, not project, but it's a story that I've posted on Archive of Our Own, as I felt that it was the best place to have people read it. And it's gotten a lot of hits during the past few months, though I first started writing it around March, at least back when I was in school, until I had graduated recently. Anyways, the main fanfics that inspired my story were A Different Lesson by Lion, I believe. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. Yeah, where it's actually a Kung Fu Panda fanfic focusing on what if Tai Lung survived his encounter with Po and was instead purified from his evilness and madness by the Wuxi Fingerhole, instead of being, sent to the spirit realm like Kung Fu Panda 3 showed. Though in this case, it's a somewhat darker, more mature take on Kung Fu Panda and the lore behind it. But I thought the move, or at least the story, was quite interesting and want to add, or at least incorporate elements of it. Though I'm not gonna copy it. Though I will kind of make allusions to some of the parts if you read that story. Sorry, which I highly recommend. And another like fanfic I read was Loved and Lost by Equine Avenger, which is, well, it's actually a My Little Pony fanfic, or more specifically the Friendship is Magic fanfic, where it's an alternate and darker take on the Canterlot wedding arc, where it shows what if Twilight didn't exactly forgive her friends and was unfortunately manipulated by an even worse threat than Queen Chrysalis, along with having been unable to actually put an end to like the potential threats to both Canterlot and Equestria, right? Which I also highly recommend that you read, as it definitely influenced some of my characters, especially my version of Mirabelle in my story, who's a lot. She has a lot more on edge, or at least she has a chip on her shoulder because of the way she was treated by her family, which will be portrayed in a more realistic, if somewhat dark manner. Don't worry, it will have a happy ending, I assure you. And speaking of Encanto fanfics, Candle in the Night was by Boba Lover 21 was actually another inspiration for my story, because I felt that it showed what would happen if Mirabelle ran away from the Encanto. Though in this case, it was right after she unfortunately was kind of humiliated during Antonio's ceremony and was once again forgotten by everyone in favor of him, hence why she left. Though in that case, Dolores ends up helping her escape, as she too felt that maybe Mirabelle wasn't happy in the Encanto, and we see a lot of angst and guilt that the Madrigals have to deal with. Though Alma and Isabel in that story are slightly less sympathetic, though they do get redeemed. Though in my story, they're a lot more complex and sympathetic, especially Isabel, though why it's kind of a spoiler. But let's just say she does not take Mirabelle's disappearance well at all. And other kind of fanfic concepts that I like, or at least heard about or even read, are accusation crossover alternate universe or fix, as in the case of Accusation Fix, where it's basically deconstructs the motives and the concepts of various characters, especially heroic characters who unfortunately cross too many lines in the show or any movie or series to be truly forgiven. And those kinds of fanfics will usually be more realistic, if somewhat cynical and dark at times, where one character that sometimes serves as an audience surrogate will call out the others for the horrible way they acted or the way they treated another character who didn't really deserve any of their mistreatment. And something like this will definitely happen with my story, as it involves characters from Coco sort of pointing out the major flaws that the Madrigals had and how selfish and entitled they come across, and along with how they had no problem taking advantage of Mirabelle only to basically throw her away, at least in their eyes. Hence why, like, the Madrigals have to go through a lot of strife along with trials and tribulations in order to redeem themselves. Hence why, like, the title's called Forgive But Never Forget, and crossover fix was another concept that inspired my story, right, as you can tell, or at least if the title didn't give it away, as it's basically a crossover between like Coco and Encanto, as the Madrigals end up meeting Miguel and the Riveras, though technically Mirabelle is the one who meets them, though how is kind of a bit of a spoiler, but I'll tell you later, right, or at least I'll sum it up later. And like, alternate universe fix also definitely inspired my story, as I felt that my story should kind of diverge from the usual canon, as I felt that maybe the reconciliation between Mirabelle and Madrigal should have been done in a more realistic manner, and even if it meant putting them through a lot of angst and humiliation, or at least the Madrigals, whereas Mirabelle practically like gets a lot of good karma thrown at her, while the Madrigals are forced to deal with a lot of bad karma, you could say, because of the way they treat her. But in this case, they kind of deserved it. Well, most of them did, but still, right? And they're forced to realize just how miserable they are without her, along with Mirabelle kind of discovering new things about not only her family but herself, right? And of course, it's a fic where I felt, well, like I mentioned before, I felt that maybe we should have dealt with the reconciliation scene much better, or at least in a more realistic way, as I felt that the movie kind of had the Madrigals get off scot-free, especially Alma, and not only them, but the fact that they kind of treated both Bruno and Mirabelle badly and never really apologized for it, though I assume they did off screen, but we just didn't see it. But in this case, they definitely have a longer way to go if they're ever going to get Bruno and Mirabelle to forgive them, as I want to show that forgiveness, well, as the title states, isn't always going to be guaranteed if you've hurt someone for too long without considering the consequences. As for who will appear in my story, well, it's like the usual story, though in this case Mirabelle is like, obviously she's the protagonist of the story, because I mean she was protagonist of Encanto, so why not feature her as a protagonist for this story, where she discovers like her real destiny along with her connection to the magic, as the movie only hinted that she had a special connection to magic despite not having any explicit gifts. But in my story, there will be an explanation as to why she didn't get a gift and how exactly it will impact her life. And of course, like the other magicals like Bruno, Alma, Dolores, Isabella, Antonio, Julieta, Augustine, Camilo, Luisa, Felix, Peppa will appear. But of course, Pedro himself will appear. Only in this case, like, he appears as, you could say, a ghost or something, but not in the way that you think. Although, like, the Coco part of the title will kind of give a hint as to how exactly he'll appear. So I can't exactly tell you guys yet. Yeah, though the main magicals that get more focus are Mirabelle, Bruno, Alma, and even Antonio, right? As Antonio will basically serve as, like, say, key character who will help Mirabelle learn to kind of forgive her family, as you can tell by the title that it will take a long time for Mirabelle to forgive her family. And of course, like, the other villagers such as Mariano Guzman, along with his mother, who in the movie went unnamed, but in my story she's called Gina Guzman, because I felt that it was fitting for her. And her name will also serve as a spoiler for like something else that'll happen in my story, as I plan on making, say, like a series out of my fanfic stories, but that I will explain later. And of course, Osvaldo, the fat guy who appeared in the beginning of the movie and at the end, will appear along with like the like Miss or Ozma Pez Muerto, like the lady with the dead goldfish, and even the bald priest like Senor Flores will appear, and he actually has a slightly bigger role, or at least he has a supporting role in my story, though that happens midway. And of course, like the village children, Alejandra, Juancho, and Cecilia will appear, though they're kind of like cameo appearances, but in their case, it's like they sort of make special cameo appearances throughout the story, though they don't really talk that much until I guess near the end. The why is like I can't exactly tell you, right? And as for the characters from Coco, well, of course, Miguel, he'll be basically the deuteragonist of the story, along with Mirabel being the main focus. As well, the reason why is because I felt that the characters from Coco kind of finished their plot and resolved, or at least solved a lot of their problems through Miguel and Hector, and of course, like Mama Coco, or Socorro as she's technically called, right? And of course, the other Rivera family members, such as like Coco, Elena, Rosa, Abel, Luisa Rivera, Enrique, Franco, like Manny and Benny, like the baby twins, like Gloria, Carmen, Berto, and of course, like baby Coco will appear in my story, as the story takes place sometime after Miguel came back and reconciled with his family, and of course after baby Coco was born. But this takes place before like the original Coco passes away, like at least like a year after the events of the original Coco. And of course, the deceased Rivera, such as Hector, Imelda, Rosita, Victoria, Julio, and oh shoot, I forgot to write like Oscar and like Felipe. But yeah, they will appear in my story as I kind of ran out of space, so apologies. And of course, like Dante and Pepita, the two Alebrije characters, well, if you haven't watched Coco, so sorry, spoiler, like they will definitely appear. And in fact, they will also be sort of key characters in my story, similar to Antonio, right? And some of the minor characters that we saw in the movie, or at least in the beginning of the movie, such as the nameless Plaza Mariachi, whose name is Chiro in my story, and even other deceased characters like the head clerk who was allergic to Dante, and of course the arrival agent whose mouth or jaw drops the moment he sees a living boy. Like their names are Eugenio and Pancho respectively, as I wanted to give them names instead of just simply calling them the head clerk or the arrival agent because it sounds a bit too redundant. And of course Ernesto de la Cruz will appear, though he's a very minor character, which is all that he deserves if you think about it, as he mainly, well, he serves as like providing some background lore regarding the Rivera family's history and the darker side as to why they banned music, and how, well, if you haven't watched the movies, it's a bit of a spoiler, but he's the reason as to why they can hate music, because he murdered Hector Rivera and made him look like he abandoned his family for selfish reasons. So of course, like, I felt that demoting him to a single cameo, albeit a very crucial cameo, but nonetheless, like, would be all that he deserved. And of course, what would a fanfic be without original characters, or at least characters that, well, there are some that I didn't create, but I merely kind of reworked them and borrowed them from various other fanfics. Though in this case, the characters that I did make for my story are Diego Jimenez, who was, like, he's an old mentor figure of Mirabel when she was younger, right? And of course there's Alita Sanchez, who's a feisty and plucky baker who exists like within the Encanto and actually has, well, let's just say she has a connection to a certain madrigal, though who their name is I can't say. You'll have to figure out for yourself. And there are others that I made, such as Sebastian Guzman, who's actually, well, in my story, he's the father of Mariano and the former, well, not former, he's the husband of Gina Guzman. As in my story, the reason why he doesn't appear in the movies because he tragically died at some point when Mario was still a child, hence why we don't see or hear him get mentioned. And of course, there are some characters that you might recognize, such as like the characters from my, or not my, but like the other fanfic that I mentioned, like Candle in the Night, where Adrian, although his name is Adrian Diego Jimenez, as he was partially his character sort of merged with another character named Diego from another fanfic that I read called like the Madrigal Obstacle and its predecessors like Mirabel's Unique Gifts, and along with his family like Jorge Jimenez, who was his little brother, Aaron Jimenez, who was his father, and Maria Jimenez. Though she was technically called Mariana Jimenez in the Candle of the Night story, but I decided to shorten it to make it sound easier. Yeah, and of course there's the Fuentes family from the list, as Bonita Fuentes is like she too works at the bakery, and she's a close friend of Mirabel and even Camilo in my story, though that will be elaborated more later. Though technically she came from another fanfic that I read called Talk to Me, which emphasized on like Camilo having a crush on a girl named Bonita. Though ironically in that story, Bonita was actually the nickname that for a reader insert character, as I've read plenty of them, like out of curiosity of how they would work. But in this case, Bonita is her real name and like nothing more. And her parents are like Sergio and Monique Fuentes, right? I'd imagine them as, well, they also work in a sort of the food industry, similar to like Alita, though in their case, well, they focus more on maybe, I guess, like something similar to like her bakery, like though it's a different kind of food. I'm still kind of, I guess, like still working through the world building aspect of my story, as like it's not only a crossover, but it's also, you could say, a sort of original story of my own, as it will feature many different like characters. And of course there's like, well, if you didn't tell by this list, there's like Bobo Marquez, yeah, who, well, obviously I didn't create him. He was a scrapped character that was supposed to appear in the early drafts of Encanto, which was somewhat different and maybe even darker. Where he was, as some of you may know, like Isabella's secret lover and apparently her fiance, as they were supposed to elope together despite how weird and gross he was. Though, well, he will appear in my story, but he's a lot more likable and less gross. And I'd imagine as having still the same kind of dorky, nerdy features, but instead of making him look weird, it would make him look more endearing and, you could say, adorable. And I'd imagine him as looking more like Augustine, or at least a younger Augustine. Though maybe I'll draw like a sketch what he could look like, but that'll be like much later. And well, ironically, in this version, like Bartoli, well, that's Bobo's real name in my story, as he's only called Bobo because, well, like it's a bit of a spoiler, but in my story, like Isabella and Bobo actually hated each other rather than being in love with each other, as they were constantly like fighting with each other, as Bobo didn't like how arrogant, perfectionist Isabella was, while Isabella didn't like how he was constantly taking jabs at her and disrespecting her. Though at the same time, she secretly respected him for being willing to stand up to her and not worship her like almost everyone else did. And he, well, in my story, he works as a florist and a horticulturist, as he and his family, or at least his parents, Angelo and Naomi Marquez, they own a flower shop of their own that Mirabel actually works at part-time. And they come to see Mirabel as like a daughter of their own, right? But unfortunately, it's about sort of like she keeps trying to butt in whenever like she can, because she believes her powers will make their business grow bigger, though in reality it just makes them more annoyed, especially Bartoli, hence why he doesn't really like her, right? Anyway, there are some other characters that I want to add, such as, well, sorry, I forgot to add another name, but there is like another character that I created for this fanfic, and in fact, he'll actually be a recurring character, or OC, you could say, that I made, and his name is Tullio, right? And I'd imagine him as being inspired by Mogans from the movie Klaus, along with like Eduardo from the Extreme Ghostbusters, because like Eduardo's Hispanic, and so is his voice actor. Though Mogans is, I think he's supposed to be like Scandinavian or something. But anyway, like he's a ferryman in my story who's known for being somewhat sarcastic, but also laid back and friendly, though he has a bit of a dark past regarding his family, which will be elaborating more in my other stories that I plan to create. And of course, how could we forget the villainous OCs such as the the Mendozas, with Gloria Mendoza being the matriarch, while Paco Mendoza is her husband, and they have 3 children named Andres, Fabio, and Valentina Mendoza, with Valentina being the youngest daughter, while Andres and Fabio are the twin eldest brothers, though they are unfortunately spoiled rotten to the core, not to mention extremely entitled and ambitious, along with being greedy and power hungry, which will definitely not make them look any sympathetic. And of course, there are other kind of, you could say, supernatural OCs that I created, such as the spirit, who is, well, she's an enigmatic figure who will appear in my story, and she's also connected to both Pedro and the Madrigals, but she mostly resides in the land of the dead, though who she is, well, I'm not gonna say because it's, again, a spoiler. And of course, there are some other deceased characters like Juanita, who is a security guard that works at the border of the land of the dead, along with Adria, who's a receptionist. And of course, there are some skeleton guards and a warden that guards a special prison for sinners or wrongdoers that committed heinous crimes in both the living world and the afterlife. Though, I won't elaborate more on why they're so important. And of course, there's a minor OC that I created called Senor Molina, who's actually the owner of the donkeys that Luisa is often forced to fetch because something keeps laying them out. Though who it is, I don't want to say as spoilers. Anyway, if you're wondering what the summary is, it goes like this. What if Mirabel did not reconcile with Alma and her family after the casita fell apart? What if she ran away, only to end up in the land of the dead due to having fallen off a cliff? What if she drifted away to the shores of Mexico, where a certain living boy would end up meeting her? Through a spiritual journey, Mirabel goes to find her grandfather Pedro and learn more about her family's dark past, with some help from the deceased Rivera family members, along with some other residents living there. She also has to find a way back to the land of the living, though whether she can gain the strength to keep living is another question. At the same time, the Madrigals, especially Alma, must find a way to earn Mirabel's forgiveness for hurting her all these years and driving her away right after Casita's destruction. Will the once magical family be able to reunite with Mirabel, or will she be lost to them forever? Yeah, pretty intriguing, right? Well, I'm afraid that's all for this video, as I don't want to kind of waste your time just simply watching or listening to this. But if you're really interested in more, then you should probably read the story yourself. I'll even provide the link for it in the description if you're curious. Though I technically have provided in my main kind of page that was supposed to introduce my Rando Ramlo channel, and I'll be talking more about it along with some of the characters and their you could say their histories, along with the lore behind my fanfics, along with many future stories that I plan, both fan-made and original. So have a good day!